May 15 marks 74 years of Al-Nakba, the Palestinian experience of dispossession and loss of their homeland. This is what the creation of Israel did to their homeland, and to this day, Palestinians in the world are marking this day. The question is, why haven't there been major strides made for the cause of Palestine or their rights? In this edition of the Spotlight, we will look at why international law continues to be broken by Israel on things like settlement building or home demolitions, and more importantly, how it has gotten away with murder. Will that be the case of the assassinated reporter, Shireen Abu Akleh? First, let's find out the latest on this day. Mona Kandil is our correspondent joining us from occupied Ramallah. Mona, obviously this is a day that is marked every year, but I think this year, given the fact that we had this assassination take place of the reporter, maybe things are up a notch or two in terms of the level of intensity out there.
Well, every year Palestinians commemorate their Nakba catastrophe. For 74 years, Palestinians have been commemorating this painful and heartbreaking anniversary for the Palestinians. We have to mention that since the forced expulsion of Palestinians, of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from their homes by Zionist groups who forced the Palestinians from their homeland in order to allow Jewish immigrants into the Palestinian land, since that day, the Israeli crimes, Israeli aggression and violence against the Palestinians didn't stop. It was an ethnic cleansing policy inside the lands that were occupied in 1948. The same thing is being carried out here in the occupied West Bank. In Al-Quds as well, Palestinians are still suffering in the Gaza Strip. Millions of Palestinians are refugees today. It's not about their ancestors who left their homeland in 1948. Palestinian refugees are living in the diaspora in many Palestinian refugee camps in Arab countries like Lebanon, Syria and Jordan, here in the occupied West Bank and in Al-Quds, as well as in the Gaza Strip. But like today, Palestinians say, despite the Israeli aggression, despite the Israeli violence, despite the settlers' crimes and the confiscation of Palestinian lands, expansion of illegal settlements, but Palestinians today, and maybe day after day, they are even more adherent to their inalienable right, to their right to return to their homes, to their villages, regardless of the fact that the Israeli regime is doing their utmost to let the world forget about the refugees issue. But Palestinians today, and through these demonstrations and protests that were carried out in the occupied West Bank as well as in the Gaza Strip, Palestinians today are saying that they are even more adherent to their right to return to their homes, and they have the right to continue resisting the Israeli occupation in order to bring it to an end.
Thank you very much for that. Mona Kandil there from occupied Ramallah. Let me introduce our guest now for this edition of the Spotlight. Hafsa Mustafa joins us. She's a journalist and Middle East expert who joins us from London. Also joining us, Amal Wahdan, a Palestinian human rights advocate who joins us from occupied Ramallah. I'd like to welcome you both, and Hafsa Mustafa, let me first start with you. If the facts are right, based on what has happened when Nakba occurred, 78% of historic Palestine ethnically cleansed, 530 villages destroyed, and about 15,000 Palestinians to have been killed in a series of mass atrocities, as it was called, with 70 massacres. One outlet has mentioned this. I mean, if you have something that's created by these acts, doesn't it mean that it is doomed to fail? Hafsa Mustafa.
I do apologize. The sound was very, very poor. Could you just, I didn't even realize it was for me. Can you just very briefly ask the question again?
Sure. Nakba being defined as ethnic cleansing, where you have so many Palestinians that were killed with their villages destroyed. If something is created that's consisted of that act, doesn't it mean that it's doomed to fail?
Well, the Nakba is obviously a catastrophe that has befallen the Palestinian people, and one that is constantly remembered by the Palestinian people every year, but also is revived every year because the Palestinian people are experiencing an annual Nakba. I mean, very recently, obviously, we've seen the murder of journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, and then the atrocious behavior during her funeral procession. So the Palestinians are experiencing the catastrophe of the Nakba almost every year, with the complicity of the world powers who were watching and actually even changing the narrative. So we've obviously as well seen the way Western media has either chosen to look the other way or actually whitewash what has happened or downplayed the severity of the crime. So there was a Nakba over 70 years ago, and there is a Nakba annually there's been a Nakba every year ever since, and this year, of course, has been a particularly painful one given the events we've seen. And unfortunately, as things appear, it seems that this coming year for Palestinians will be just as catastrophic as the past ones we've seen before.
So if we were to take a look at what Israel has achieved, Amal Wahdan, throughout these past 74 years, what can be said about that? We're looking at them executing illegal acts on a daily basis. They are breaking international law. They've been categorized as an apartheid regime. You have Israelis that are fleeing Israel, actually, and their security is still in danger. So what have been their accomplishments?
Well, according to the Israelis, they think that they have accomplished their independence, which is absolutely false claim, because this independence for us means colonization. They were given this right, between brackets, to build a state at the expense of the Palestinians. The ethnic cleansing of 1948, which what you said absolutely right, it's ethnic cleansing war, and that's how we define it. When they forced out about 1 million Palestinians outside of their homes, destroyed over 500 villages, destroyed and burned more than 500 villages, and committed genocide against Palestinians. Scores of massacres took place in 1948. One of the most popular one is Deir Yassin, where they killed about 253 Palestinians, burned the corpse of about 100 of them, and they took a bunch of them and walked through the streets of Jerusalem to terrorize other Palestinians. Actually, this was a real alert to other Palestinians. It scared Palestinians, and which forced them gradually up to the north or to the east to escape the massacres. And accomplishment, according to the Israelis, is building a state at the expense of other people, displacing, dispossession of Palestinians out of their villages, out of their cities, outside the countries, and refusing to let them in, despite so many UN resolutions like 194, right of return for Palestinians. Up till now, we have 7 million people living in more than 62 refugee camps in the West Bank and Gaza. 500,000 people live within what they call Israel, which is occupied Palestine of 1967. They were displaced from their villages, and they forced to live in other villages inside 1948 and up until now. And regardless of so many efforts and legal cases, they cannot go back to their homes again.
Let's take
all
that.
These Palestinians.
Yeah, let's take that point up with Hafsa Mustafa. I know the audio connection is not that great, but this is about the right of return, which our guest was talking about there, and she mentioned a figure of 7 million, and that's a lot. And you would think that throughout all these years, if anything, there should have been some kind of political will from the respective countries that these Palestinians are in, particularly the Arab countries that they're in, from the Arab leaders, to have done something to get some kind of, at least a percentage of them back to their homeland. But that wasn't done. Why do you think that has happened? Again, we're talking about a length of time here that's going on decades now.
Of course, and I think the role of Arab leaderships, and particularly more recently, has been atrocious because it has made a bad situation worse. And obviously, in light of what we're seeing more recently, I think it's absolutely astonishing that there hasn't been a suspension of relations with Israel with the newly formed relationships that have happened in the past few years. But again, I mean, the failure of Arab governments to actually tackle this issue more forcefully is astonishing. And I think it's also more worrying given that there is actually a political leverage that many Arab countries have, namely with resources such as oil and gas, which could be withheld or reduced in exchange for more rights for Palestinians, for instance, at a time where tensions are high with Russia and European economies are very reliant on Russian gas. So there is room for maneuver for many Arab countries to tackle this issue, but they're simply failing to do that. And it is very frustrating. And of course, it's even more frustrating to see that, again, in light of the Russian crisis, we're seeing Israelis bring in thousands upon thousands of Ukrainians on the basis that they're simply Jewish, and therefore they can replace the indigenous Palestinian population simply by virtue of claiming some sort of Jewish ancestry, when the actual population of Palestine is expelled on a daily basis. Is even more frustrating. But again, this is the situation we have with the terrorist state of Israel and terrorist governments, really Western governments, that are accomplices in this and that are supporting Israel in its terrorist activities, sadly.
Yeah, I'm looking down a list of stuff that I'd like to discuss with you, Amal Watan here. And one of the things that doesn't get mentioned much, even though I think is probably one of the most important ones, is the enactment of what's called the nation state of the Jewish people. It doesn't get mentioned much except for when it came out. Can you tell us what that is and how that endangers Palestinians' existence on their own land?
Well, first of all, there is no legal by international law to carve Palestine from the homeland of Greater Syria and give it or grant it to the Jewish people in order to establish their Jewish homeland. Why would they do something like this unless it is for the interest of the colonial powers at that time? Even in 1922, when the British mandate was over Palestine, started over Palestine, it was also against international law. Who gave them this authority? Who gave these colonial powers the right to carve Palestine and give it to another people who do not relate to this land at all? They gathered like probably over 60 or 70 70 nations, Jewish from 70 nations, and brought them into Palestine, where they do not belong. Actually, Ethiopians, for example, Arab Jews whom they brought from Morocco, from Yemen, from Iraq, from other parts of the Arab world, why would they bring these people in here unless there is a scheme? First, the Zionist project, which actually goes along with the colonial power interest in this area. They wanted to build a military base for the colonial powers in this geography here to suit the colonial powers. So this was given in false grounds. It's against international law. It's against human rights law. Even the General Assembly has no jurisdiction to give such a law or such a resolution, the partition of 1948. They don't have any right to do such because it's not under their mandate to partition part of a land and give it to another people. But they did because the US, the UK, and their allies decided to do so. And that's how this whole thing started, actually. And the Zionist movement has its own terrorist gangs which terrorized the people to force them out of the land. They wanted a clean land from the Arabs, from its indigenous people. And Arab countries at that time, the reactionary Arab countries at that time didn't budge. And they continue to do the same role. They continued, actually, since 1948. This didn't change. The Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris, they played according to the U.S. scheme.
Right.
They wanted this land empty of any Arab.
Sure.
Otherwise, what would an Ethiopian, with all respect to all people, but what would Ethiopians, how would they relate to such land? This land has its own people, and Palestinians and Arabs in this part of the world go back to 10,000 years. So
Sure.
Legal ground or human ground for any international institution to replace the indigenous people with people from all from the whole world, from countries and nations of the whole world.
Let's bring Hafsa Kara Mustafa into this. Hafsa Kara Mustafa, maybe at no other time in recent memory have we seen, in a span of about a month to 6 weeks, what we have witnessed in the occupied territories, particularly starting with the month of Ramadan, where you had the Al-Quds being vandalized and being desecrated. You had the Palestinians that were beaten, handcuffed. You had the settlers who came into the mosque, I think just a couple of days ago that happened, escorted by Israeli police. And you also had, for example, what happened in Tel Aviv with an act of resistance, as it was called. It took the lives of some Israelis, a Palestinian that did that. And then you had Al-Quds Day, where after 2 years, hundreds of thousands of people came out across the world, which could add up to even more. And then you had what topped that, in a sense, which was unfortunate assassination of Shireen Abu Akleh, the reporter that everybody's still mourning. So we've seen what has happened. The outpouring of people, in terms of the numbers, is my question to you. When you have all these people to have come out, whether it's at the funeral procession or whether it was Al-Quds Day or otherwise, how can we channel all that energy in order to fight for Palestinian rights in terms of the numbers that we saw?
Again, I think I mean, the numbers are there, but I think the political will from governments, including from governments that should be sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, is not materializing. And I think that's the problem. Because if you look at, for instance, the media, there is a completely, there's a very clear distinction between the sentiment, the overall sentiment, whether it's on Palestine, whether it's on the Russia and Ukraine issue, and what the media is portraying. And the media tries to reflect what the governments are trying to say or trying to sell. And that's where the problem lies, because there is a distinction between what the people are saying and doing and feeling, in particular towards Palestine, and what their governments are doing. So I think that energy should be channeled against individual governments, because it's very easy to sort of perhaps write or say something against Israel. We know Israel is the culprit, that it goes beyond any doubt. But actually, if each individual country challenged their own governments and their own elected officials, then that would have some impact, because it's these politicians that are aiding and abating what Israel is doing. For instance, in the US, congressmen and congresswomen who are on the payroll of Israeli lobbies are actually going into the Congress to fight Israel's battle. So if American voters, for instance, pressured them into acting on behalf, at the very least, of Americans instead of Israel, there would be a shift in action. The same with the UK, for instance. If MPs were being held to account by the electorate and said, well, actually, Israel is a non-vote, it doesn't help you get votes, then things would change. But so I think the way to do this is to channel energy at each country, at each individual country. Continue to blame Israel, of course. Stop relying on certain Arab governments, because they're lost, and actually lobby each and every Western government. Wherever you have pro-Palestinian voices, they need to lobby their own governments and their own local politicians.
Is that something that you see being a viable way forward, but with more intensity, Amal Wahdan?
Yes, of course. Foreign supporters and support groups in different parts of the world means a lot to the Palestinian struggle for their just right, and for their liberty. And we can see that it is advancing, actually. They have accomplished a lot in their countries with their MPs and with their BDS movement, boycotting and divesting from apartheid Israel. And this is also very helpful for our struggle as Palestinians. But also here in our homeland, the Palestinians have to advance their struggle against this apartheid regime here, and they have to unite their effort on the ground, and they have to unite with other also liberation movement, Arab liberation movement around us, and the resistance, axis of resistance, of course, because together we can stand against and defy the U.S. coalition operation room, which it's equipped with everything that can prevent us from advancing forward. And from the other hand, people's power on the ground can defy the Israeli apartheid regime and can defy as well the U.S. complicity with this apartheid regime.
Okay.
There is a lot to be done together with the international community, with the free people of the world, in order to achieve our right on the ground.
Last question goes to Hafsa Mustafa. We have to mention this because we just need to, because it's one of the biggest stains, I think, that Israel is continuing to really exercise, and that is what's happening in the Gaza Strip. I mean, really, that is just something that's unbelievable in the siege. What can we expect from the resistance groups, of which they've tried to do what they can in terms of standing up for the Palestinian rights? Do they need to do more?
We go back to the funeral of fellow journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. The fact that she's a Christian woman who was supported and taken to her grave by Muslims and Christians alike is something that is very disturbing to Israelis, because that implies that if Muslims and Christian Palestinians unite, then they're a force to be reckoned with. And I think that sense of unity is one that we should be looking to thrive for at every level. So again, Hamas and the PLO need to work together and need to work in order to unite the Palestinian people. I think we need to work through all the differences that are happening today across the Muslim Arab world, the wider Middle East, and form unity in order to challenge the terrorist state of Israel.
Thank you very much for that. Hafsa Mustafa, journalist and Middle East expert from London. And Amal Wahdan, thank you, Palestinian human rights advocate from Ramallah, of which we had Mona Kandil at the top of the Spotlight, our correspondent. And that does it for this edition of the Spotlight. From Mikhail Tagway and the team. It's goodbye until next time.